Hi everyone, my name is James from Blue North Woodworking, and yes, I know I have cutting board oil on my shirt, whatever. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this 3 foot by 2 foot by 2 inch thick walnut cutting board. Here we go. I made a trip to the Black Forest Wood Company here in Calgary and picked up some 8-quarter walnut. I was unloading these from my truck when all of a sudden, I got my finger. And look at this overreaction. Hands on knees. Grow up, James. As you can hear from the sound of the board hitting the workbench, these boards are quite heavy, so in my defense, it hurt. I measured these boards out to 37 inches wide, as the finished size of the cutting board was 36 inches. I brought them over to my miter saw station, if that's what you can call it, and was quickly reminded that, James, you need to build a miter station. Build video incoming. My jointer is only 8 inches wide, so at 7 inches I am ripping these walnut boards down with my Makita cordless track saw so that I can run them across my jointer. I am a huge fan of this track saw. I got it last year and I have been using it a lot. I think it's an excellent tool. I then took these boards over to my jointer, jointing the face first, followed by the edge, and made an absolute mess because I don't have dust collection. I draw these little squiggles on the board here before putting them through the planer so that I know the board is perfectly flat and all of the top surface level of the wood has come off after coming out of the planer. I don't know if I'm speaking for all other woodworkers, but I absolutely love taking rough cut lumber and milling it perfectly square. It is probably the most satisfying part about woodworking for me. I brought these boards over to my table saw and ripped them at 2 1/8 inch as I wanted 2 inches for the finished thickness of this board. This walnut had an extreme amount of tension in it. So much so that I would end up having to push boards through, and once they got past the riving knife, I would end up turning my saw off, taking a little wedge and sticking it inside the board like this to relieve some of that tension. Once I did that, this made the cut a lot easier, and I think my table saw really thanked me. I swept clear the extreme amount of dust that I made from the jointer so that I could lay the boards out to do the glue up. I put this blue painter's tape down on these black pipe clamps because I find that when I do glue ups, it's almost like the wood absorbs some of this black oil from the clamps, so that's why I put the painter's tape down. I then bring the wood strips down and lay them sideways across the clamps like I'm doing here, rotating them 90 degrees so that I can apply the glue. I use Titebond 3 and apply it very liberally to my glue ups. Titebond 3 is the type of glue that you want to use if you're making cutting boards because it is food safe as well as waterproof. I find glue ups to be stressful, and this is the largest board that I have ever made, so I definitely wanted this to go well. I didn't realize that, when you have a bigger board, it takes longer to set everything up. So by this point, I was getting somewhat stressed for time because you only have like 10 or 15 minutes for the glue to set. By the end of it, I had 7 clamps on there and it all came out okay. All right, fast forward a little bit and the board is out of clamps and it is flat. So I took this to the Black Forest Wood Company here in Calgary to have them flatten it, basically because my workbench isn't wide enough to do this on my router sled. And here we are. On to the rest of the build video. I set up my track saw guide rail and used a couple micro jig clamps to lock this rail into place. And then I cut this board down to 36 inches wide using the track saw, doing a couple passes so that I can ensure I get a clean cut because this is pretty thick walnut. Because this was the biggest board I've ever built, the juice groove jig that I have already did not work for this board, so I needed to make another one. I simply ripped this piece of plywood at 3 inches wide and used that as the rails. I don't typically rip big sheets of plywood on my table saw, and as you can tell, I'm not the most comfortable doing this, but whatever. I then cut the strips into the appropriate size pieces, drilled them together like so, and then put these up against the edge of the board and then drilled it to a piece of plywood to keep them in place. I then used this round nose router bit that is a 1/2 inch wide and ran the bit along the fence of the juice groove jig. I will admit that doing juice grooves does make me quite nervous because you have put so much work into the board at this point, so if something were to go wrong, like the router jumps off of the fence, it would be, for lack of a better word, catastrophic. I go slow, I take very shallow passes. I think I did 4 to 5 passes here to ensure that I got a clean cut. I then put a small chamfer on the top of the board using this chamfer bit, which I think gives a really nice finished look to the top of the board. And at the request of the customer, she wanted a pretty decent sized bevel on the underside of the board, which I agree gives it a very nice finished look. So I did that with my bigger Bosch router here. Again, I did this in multiple passes because I didn't want any tear out happening if I took too big of a pass. So this is where you can see I had already done 1 pass, and then I did the last pass here. And that's going to bring us to sanding, everybody's favorite thing to do. To be honest, I don't mind sanding despite what my face may show here. I'm usually listening to a podcast or listening to music, which are 2 things that I truly enjoy doing. Here I'm trying to hand sand end grain, and everybody knows that hand sanding end grain would take forever. I wanted to do it because I wanted to keep this bevel looking sharp, and I felt like if I were to use my Mirka sander, it would just be too aggressive. But I ended up switching to the Mirka. It was just taking way too long, and I didn't have the patience for that. And it managed to keep nice, crisp lines anyways, so that's what I ended up doing. When the customer originally approached me for this board, I didn't think it was gonna happen. The message came in saying, "Hi there, I'm looking for a cutting board that is 3 foot by 2 foot by 2 inches thick." And I was like, oh my God, that's a massive cutting board. And then she said, "I want it to be made out of walnut." And I said, oh my God, that's going to be the most expensive cutting board ever. But the customer was on board, we had a deal, and I got down to it. I was honestly really excited to get this started because I have been making the same size serving boards and cutting boards for a long time, so I was excited for the challenge. I know I've already complained about juice grooves once, and yes, they're stressful to do, but they are such a pain to sand. I use this little dowel with some Mirka sandpaper, and I just get in there. It sucks, but someone's got to do it. After I was done sanding the juice grooves, I then sprayed the board down with water. After you sand the board smooth, the first time the board comes into contact with water, it's going to raise the grain of the wood fibers. So if you're going to be passing this item on to a customer, or even if you just want to maintain a nicely smooth board yourself, you need to raise the grain of the wood fibers and let the board dry. Once the wood fibers are raised, you then have to resand. The way that I sand is I sand my boards at 120, 180, 220, then I pop the grain, and then I sand it at 320, and then the board's done. As someone that typically makes cutting boards that are 18 by 12, working with this board that was 3 foot by 2 foot and weighed 39 pounds, I was getting kind of tired of moving it around. This is a bit of a concern for me because I'm looking to be a table maker in the future, and having to flip slabs over and over again is something that I'm not really looking forward to doing. I'm hoping that I can befriend a big strong neighbor. I then hit the board with the air compressor to get all of the fine sawdust out of the grains. As you can see, I'm being pretty thorough with this and taking my time because it's a very important step in the process. I then take my branding iron and put my logo on the underside of the board, Blue North Woodworking. There we go. The customer then asked me to engrave her family's last name on the front of the board. If you are in the cutting board game and you don't have a laser engraver, you are doing it wrong. This is so important to me. This is the foundation of my business. I'm going to be making a video all about this. I then apply Walrus Oil's cutting board oil to my boards. I've been using this product for about 2 years. It's a combination of mineral oil and beeswax, and I really, really like the finish that it provides. If you are a new woodworker trying to grow your social media, I highly recommend filming this and putting it on your TikTok or Instagram or whatever. People really like watching this part. After letting the board soak up some of this walrus oil, I buff it in with a blue shop rag. You'll notice I'm going in counterclockwise direction because I'm just kidding. It doesn't matter at all. Just buff it in there, guys. After I'm done buffing the board, I apply feet to the bottom. I measure a 1/2 inch in by a 1/2 inch in, make a mark with my pencil, and then I pre-drill. As you can see, the feet are very close to the edge of this board, and I think if you weren't to pre-drill, there is a chance that this board would crack or split, being that close to the end grain. I then use my driver to slowly drive the screw into the board. After I finished applying the rest of the feet, that is it, and we are done. Well, that's it for this one. Thank you guys for tuning in. I really appreciate it. I have a favor to ask of you. If you guys liked the video, I would super appreciate if you can either subscribe to my channel or leave a like or a comment on the video. I am trying to grow my YouTube channel in the hopes that I can grow my woodworking business. So if you do think that I have earned your subscription, I would super appreciate that. It just lets me know that I'm on the right track to keep going with what I'm doing. Thank you very much, and I will see you next video. Have a good one.